Welcome to the Rescape podcast, where we explore the value of play. In this episode, we talk to Michael Tremblay, a lifelong martial artist and a Ph.D. in philosophy. Michael has a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and has competed professionally in mixed martial arts. His philosophy work looks at Stoicism as a means of self-improvement and the connection between sport and moral development. Without further ado, here's Michael Tremblay.
From age 6, you were introduced to Jiu-Jitsu?
Yes, I mean, I'm sure I was. My dad opened up his club full time when I was 6, and they ran not exactly analogous to what you had, but it was like a workout gym, like an exercise gym that then also taught jiu-jitsu. And that was in '98, but we probably had some exposure to it beforehand. I can't really remember. And then for me, I never really liked it, which I think is probably a similar experience for some people. But it was always kind of in the background, but I never really enjoyed it. I was a very nerdy kid. And then I competed for the first time. My dad made me wrestle in high school, and I did my first competition, and then I fell in love with it because I wasn't very good, but it was this, it was just this incredible. Sorry, my cat is exploring, who wants to say hi. There was just such a degree of accountability in martial arts and personal responsibility to performance. Like all the sports I'd done before then were team-based, in this way where like you would win a soccer game, but you wouldn't score the goal. You wouldn't really feel like you contributed or that it was up to you. It was up to the better people on your team. But, I came 4th out of 8 in my first wrestling tournament. It was like, that was me. That was, I earned that. I deserved that. The mistakes were mine as well. And those are mistakes that I can fix. And that for some reason had some sort of mindset shift. And I started thinking of myself more as an athlete after that.
Right on. What age were you then?
So I was 14. So that was like grade 9, first year of high school in Canada.
So you had a conflict with jiu-jitsu between 6 and 14, and it was then you got to it?
Yeah. Well, like my dad never forced us into it. It was just kind of like, you got to do sports as a kid growing up because it's healthy. So I would be bored, I'd be stretching, I'd be going through the techniques. I'd be the coach's kid too, right? So you're just kind of like, I have to be here. But I was a nerd, right? I was like, I wanted to be at home playing video games and, reading my comic books and stuff. So yeah, it wasn't a conflict because he didn't force me or my sister into it. But it was just kind of like, brush your teeth, do your chores. It was kind of like a thing we had to do. But I didn't like it until that age, until I competed for the first time.
Right on. It's interesting that you say you were a nerd. You just wanted to be at home playing video games and reading your comic books. And then you end up as a BJ black belt, and then you also end up a doctor of Stoicism. Mm-hmm. And something that's got my attention is this concept of, first of all, at the center of video games and comic books is normally a hero. Mm-hmm. And then the hero seems to personify these age-old, eternal virtues that travel across multiple cultures, multiple generations. And it's somewhere inside there, I think, does Stoicism start to explore these virtues themselves that are age-old. I mean, they almost pass over into the animal kingdom. Like we have these brave lions, and we address animals in these virtuous ways. You have the samurai who have traits that when I look at it, there seems to be some correlation between Zen and samurai and the Stoic Greeks. And there's no way these guys were WhatsApping each other. Just, hey, here's something you guys should consider. So it's these kind of like almost archetypical virtues. Maybe you can speak to that in a way that perhaps early days on, you had a calling to explore this realm.
Yeah, sure. I think that, since we're going that direction, I think there's some sort of mythos or stories that appeal to you. And I don't know if there's a cause and effect. Like, I don't know if you engage with a certain piece of art or a certain narrative and it constructs a kind of worldview, or if you seek out the kind of art that affirms that worldview. But the hero narrative for me was definitely Dragon Ball Z. So it was this, and Dragon Ball Z, for those that haven't watched it, is is this kind of virtuous, what's this virtuous character who encounters harder and harder challenges and then struggles and then eventually overcomes those. And it's really this story about progress through challenge and failure and difficulty, right? Which connects to this Stoic concept of, growth mindset, or the obstacle is the way, which we could talk about more. But that kind of hero mythos definitely appealed to me. This idea of a person through merit, through effort, who constructs themselves, develops themselves, takes accountability and responsibility, rather than the kind of person who's, perhaps born into greatness or has a destiny, but rather, constructs that for themselves. I don't know, that was inspiring and empowering for me. And I think perhaps as a kid who didn't find themselves particularly athletic, this idea of latching to this idea of personal accountability and meritocracy and effort was appealing to me. The other thing you talked about is this kind of cross-cultural connection. And one of the things that's incredibly valuable about doing history of philosophy, or I think history in general, is that if you encounter anything that resonates with you when you're doing history, you're engaging in an entirely separate worldview, an entirely separate paradigm, right? So if somebody says something and that resonates with you as being true, and they said it 2,000 years ago, you're almost guaranteed that they're hitting on something important. And I remember I said this in front of one of my philosophy professors, and I said, you're almost guaranteed they're hitting on something true. And he paused, he goes, "Oh, something important, but not necessarily true." And I think that's a good distinction, because there can be similarities between the ways humans respond or think about things that could be false. But at the very least, if we're identifying those similarities, it's something important about the human experience, and it's something, meaningful or valuable to look more into. So that's one of the reasons I like history, is you're cutting through all the fluff, right? You think of like a classic rock station, how much music was released in the 80s, but if you listen to the classic rock station, it's just all the greatest hits. Like time has already filtered through and refined out just the valuable parts. And when we're doing history of philosophy, when we're doing Stoicism, which is, for those that don't know, a 2,500-year-old philosophy, history has already done that. Every book that was great, some monk was like, this is too good. I have to record this. I have to write this down. I have to copy this. Some library was like, we need to keep 50 copies. So the things, obviously we've lost a lot that's valuable, but we've basically kept nothing that was invaluable, I should say. Yeah. And so I think those similarities, I think that what Stoicism provides, what Samurai provides, is life was really, really difficult. And they provide a series of insights into how to navigate really, really difficult existences. And you see the same thing in Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I don't know if either of you have read that, but you end up with something that's very stoic there. And, it's creating an entirely separate cultural context, but the cultural context is incredible human suffering, and how to navigate that and how to flourish in that context. My cat wants to attack the microphone because I'm talking here. Oh.
Yeah, right on. Like, central to Viktor Frankl's book was, I suppose, how he found his way to navigate or maintain his mental health, his focus, his willingness to live, by anchoring it in the desire to see his daughter again, I think, wasn't it? Or was it his wife? And it was grounded in love and relationship. Mm-hmm. Is there something similar in Stoicism when because my understanding of Stoicism, which is going to be completely shattered in this conversation, I'd imagine, because it's very, very minuscule, but I get that there is an element of practical self-reflection within Stoicism. This is my take on it so far. So then, is there, myself and Colin were talking before this, and this is part of where I'm going with this. It was that there's a small view that Colin was saying across perhaps maybe the youth of today, that Stoicism, in a way, maybe fast food Stoicism, is like macho emotional management, in a way, like perhaps like it's suppressing your emotionality. But I get the impression that something that has lasted this long is far from that, and perhaps there's deeper roots, maybe closer connected to like Frankl with his love. Is there something closer to the truth or important about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to, we have a lot of different directions we can take this conversation in terms of both the sport and the philosophy, but I'm happy to dig into Stoicism as deep as we want to go. Right. But the basic view with Stoicism about emotions, you want to have a better understanding, right? So I use kind of a physical analogy for this, right? With any kind of situation, you want to first diagnose, so if you're trying to say, how in shape am I? You want to go for a run, you want to test your flexibility, you want to first diagnose and identify. And there's this kind of, in Stoicism, there's this first level of just mindfulness. So just kind of, in every stage is the opposite of repression, right? Because the very first stage is a mindfulness and awareness of what are you feeling, right? If you're feeling sad or you're feeling angry and you don't kind of sit in that and you don't recognize that and identify that, you're lacking that diagnostic step. You don't really identify your emotional stage. And then the next level is to get a good relationship with your emotions. And then what does a good relationship mean, right? We're bringing values into that. And for the Stoics, a good relationship is the view that your emotions are based on true beliefs, right? So they have a cognitive view of emotion, which is separate from, so one way you could look at emotions is you could say, look, I have an animal part of me, and this animal part of me is pulling me in certain directions and making me feel certain things, but that's not me. I'm this brain, I'm this reason. And the Stoic view is, no, these are much more intertwined than that. So when I feel things, that's a physical response to a cognitive representation I have of the world, right? And a simple example, I use this example. You're watching a sports game with your friend and you're cheering for different teams, and one team wins and you're elated and they're depressed. So you're having entirely different emotional responses to the same stimulus, right? And the reason for that is the way that you're conceiving of this stimulus. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And if you think it's good, you're elated. If you think it's bad, you're depressed or upset. Likewise for things like anger is a view that you've been harmed and it's someone else's fault, right? So the Stoic view on relating with your emotions is absolutely not repression. It is to develop a healthy relationship with them. What a healthy relationship means is that it's based on true beliefs. So, someone insults me, right? And I'm angry with them. And it's this view that I've been harmed. And so the Stoic view is like, have you actually been harmed, right? What does harm mean? And it asks you to kind of identify and interrogate your values that are producing this emotion. And then the Stoics have this other response, which is that, no, you actually haven't been harmed, right? Because, what determines the quality of your life, what determines, whether or not you're doing well has nothing to do with like other words someone has spoken to you. So that emotion, that anger is incorrect, not because it's an emotion, but because it's based on a false judgment. And when you end up eliminating all of those, cognitive distortions, as they might say in like contemporary cognitive behavioral therapy or something like this, what you actually are left with is a much more even keel existence where there's a lot less extreme bad things going on than most people think. And that's where kind of the Stoic, the not extreme response comes from, not from suppressing animal urges or suppressing non-rational parts of yourself, but by developing a healthy relationship with your value system and having that result in less extreme emotions.
Right on. No, this is so good. So Marcus Aurelius has a book, Meditations. It's in my bag, and it's something I just pull out if I have an opportunity. I have a few minutes. I mean, it's one of those books you can just read, and there's nuggets the whole way through it. But it's called Meditations. What's interesting is the term meditation, it seems to be context dependent, or maybe even culturally dependent, because a meditation to a yoga or a yogi doesn't seem to me to be the same as a person who is practicing, let's say, Stoicism. And it's not often I hear of someone practicing Stoicism. But what you detail there sounds to me in and of itself as a practice. It's not something that you just go, oh, I know, I have a decision I'll make. From here on out, I'll be very rational between my emotive self and my behavior. This sounds like a very long process, a self-reflective process. And so you can go to a yoga class, for example, but I don't think you can go to a Stoicism class. And maybe you can speak about practicing Stoicism. And I get the impression that it's intertwined with physicality, that it would, or at least there's a complementary element to maybe athletics, wrestling inside there.
Yeah, we can go so deep on these. I don't want to say we're gonna I could spend the whole time talking about this one thing. So this is what I wrote my PhD on, right? I wrote my PhD on so Epictetus. Let me zoom out a bit, right? So Stoicism is, because I'm assuming people here, this is not a Stoicism podcast, so the knowledge forms are going to be eclectic and varied. So I'll just zoom out a bit. So Stoicism is an ancient Greek philosophy. So it's a conception of how to live that came out around 300 BC in ancient Athens. There was a variety of these coming out and competing at particular times. And they all thought, the part of philosophy is to become a good person. And the point of philosophy is to become a good person and be happy. But they had different answers to what it meant to be a good person and how to achieve happiness. For the Stoics, what it meant to be a good person is to be virtuous, to act well, right? Then we contrast this with that might sound obvious, but you contrast this with someone like Aristotle, who says, to be a good person is to be virtuous and super rich and like really handsome and really good at sports. And so like for Aristotle, to be a good person was this combination of internal character and external excellence, right? He's like, obviously, Batman is obviously the coolest person ever because he's a great person and he's a billionaire, right? And for the Stoics, they detached that external part. They said, no, it's really all about your character. You can be a great person and you can be said to have a great life, even if you got tortured, even if you were incredibly poor, as long as you were navigating the cards you were dealt as well as you could. That was the Stoic contribution. And then the main works we have remaining from the Stoics were from Marcus Aurelius, who was emperor of Rome, so this most important person in the world at the time, at least in the Western world, most powerful person in the world. Seneca, who was another very powerful Roman, and Epictetus. I looked at Epictetus in my PhD, and Epictetus is interesting because he was actually a slave. So he was a slave in Rome. He was physically disabled. Some reports claim that he was beaten by his slave owner to the point where he mangled his leg, and that was his disability. And then he gained his freedom and left Rome and opened up a school of Stoic philosophy. So my PhD was on Stoic pedagogy. It was on looking about how do you engage in a Stoic practice? What does a Stoic practice mean? And how do you cultivate virtue? And so there's this theme or this concept of moral education, and this is a very important one that we don't talk about as much anymore, which is this idea of ethics is this identification of what is right and wrong. And then moral education is okay, I know I should do this. How do I become the kind of person that does this? And you can look at diet or nutrition. I mean, you might have to correct me if I'm wrong, but there's obviously an analogy to be pulled out here, right? Where there's this view of like, this is what carbs are, this is what protein is, this is what fat is, this is the proper combination, this is how much calories you should be getting. And then there's this question of how do athletes or people looking to be fit become the kind of people that can follow the instruction they've been given by their nutritionist, by their coach. And these are two separate issues, right? One is a kind of a knowledge issue or kind of an abstract issue, and one is a applied motivational issue. And I'm really interested in this applied issue because I think most people have an intuitive understanding of what it means to be better versions of themselves that is accessible. Nobody's like confused about how to be a better person. They all know and are having trouble navigating that, maybe at the very high level. And again, I think that nutrition example is helpful because, when you're looking at being an Olympic champion, it matters that exact ratio, it matters that exact combination. But for most people, it's just like, cut out the junk in your diet, get more sleep. Like most people are not at that 95th, 99th percentile where knowledge is the limiting factor. For most people, it's motivation. So then when we talk about a Stoic practice, that's the question I'm interested in is, okay, I want to be a virtuous person. I want to respond well to the cards I'm given. I want to not have extreme emotions. How do I cultivate that? And I looked at a couple of different ways of doing that. So one way obviously is an education ways. You have to learn about Stoicism. You have to learn about whatever practice you're trying to engage with. You have to gain that knowledge part. And then the second part was practice. And then there's a couple forms of practice. So one form is when we're doing Stoicism is looking at your mind, your mindfulness and your capacity to understand what's going on in your mind as a kind of skill that you want to cultivate. So I guess that is just mindfulness, right? A capacity to reflect upon the kind of thoughts you're having, the way that you make decisions, that you come to form beliefs, and the results those beliefs have on your behaviors and your actions. So one step to practice is just general mindfulness and an awareness of what you think and what you believe. So to bring this back to a Stoic example, the Stoics think that what you first have is you have an impression. So when we go through any event, let's say I get very angry. What we first have is we have an impression. We have an interpretation of something that's occurred. So let's say I'm walking down the street and I bump into somebody. We hit shoulder to shoulder. I have an interpretation of that event, and that interpretation I don't have much control over. I'm bringing in a lot of baggage into that. If I'm a person very concerned with honor, maybe my interpretation is like, oh, this person is just like been very rude, or they've offended me, or they haven't gotten out of the way like they should because I'm walking down the sidewalk and, watch out for me. And that's kind of this impression. We obviously want to work on fixing those. And then you have this space. And Viktor Frankl talks about this, the space between impulse and assent, or impression and assent, impression and belief. And in that space, there's freedom. And so for the Stoics is to say that what separates animals from humans for the Stoic is that for animals, it's input output, right? You put food in front of the dog salivates, input output. And you can train a dog as you can train for X input, I'm going to get a different output, but there's no space in between input output. And where human power lies and our gift of reason and intellect and self-awareness is that we have a gap between those two. So I receive the input, but then I don't have to necessarily have the output. There's a degree of power, autonomy, and control in between those steps. So I would say one of the first, so using the example is I bump into the person, I get a reaction like, oh, they've offended me. And then I say, oh, I don't really know what's going on here. I don't know who this person is. Maybe it was an accident. I start considering alternatives. I start going through those things. And then I choose to discard this belief that I've been harmed or that I've been offended or that and I don't get angry. And I move on with my day. And I say, oh, sorry about that. We bumped into each other, and I move on. Right. And that's where human freedom lies. But most people, if you haven't engaged in mindfulness, a Stoic practice, or some other form of that, they don't realize that space exists, and they're existing on input output. And maybe later on they're sitting at home and they go, oh, I really got upset there. And that really wasn't that big of a deal. And they can kind of reflect later. But in the moment, it's just, somebody cuts you off in traffic and you're upset. Right. So one of the first stages to a Stoic practice is to delay that process and extend that space for as long as possible, and develop kind of a mindfulness such that you disassociate yourself with your initial impulses and your initial responses, and recognize that those are not the truth. Those are representations of the world that I can then decide if I want to agree with and commit to, or discard and not commit to, and not feel the emotional turbulence that comes with them. So that's one aspect to a Stoic practice. There's a couple others. And so one of the things, the meditations, right, you talked about with Marcus Aurelius, this is a journal that he's written for himself, right? And one of the aspects of journaling that the Stoics like is it's a cultivation of mindfulness. So it's an interrogation of your own beliefs. Where is the state of your own mind? What did I feel today? Why did I feel it? Do I want to feel that way? Is that true? Do I want to believe those things? Do I want to live by those values? Whereas most people are not reflecting in that degree. So that reflection can have an incredible benefit. So that was the first part. And we can obviously go deeper into that about a Stoic practice. And the second part was the connection with sport, wrestling and things like this. And one of the things that I've argued, which, the Stoics what the Stoics say is that anything can be helpful to the Stoic practice insofar as you approach it with the intent to become a better Stoic. Right. So the Stoics are not, they don't argue very strongly for sport. That being said, they make a lot of analogies with athletes, right? So Marcus Aurelius talks about himself, he says, I'm a wrestler, but not a fencer, because like my tools are part of my body. They're things that I have with me. We think about mindfulness. We think about our ability to navigate situations well. Those are things we have with us. Another Stoic compares mindfulness to being a pancrationist, which is the ancient Greek MMA fighter, because he's like, they're always in a fighting stance, so they're always ready for whatever comes, and you want your mind in that same way to be ready to counter or defend against whatever negative impressions come your way, to say those aren't true, or I don't need to follow that one. So they make these analogies with athletes in the sport. The one thing I argue is that in a contemporary context, if you're a slave in Rome, you don't need artificial difficulty to practice your temperance or your courage or your virtues or your capacity to navigate difficult impressions well, right? So for the Stoics, I've given this picture of impression, space, kind of impulse, result, emotion. And what happens when you begin training is you need to learn how to navigate the hard impressions. It's not difficult, like, oh, there's a tree over there. That's not a judgment that's going to cause you problems, but I'm running and I'm half an hour into a run and I want to quit because pain is seeming to me like a very bad thing. That's a very difficult impression to say, no, this pain is not a bad thing. It's not harming me. It's a sensation, right? That is a very difficult impression to navigate. So to connect that, if you're a slave in Rome, you have plenty of these. You don't need to practice this. But I think for many people, we're at a point where our lives are sufficiently pleasant that to cultivate a kind of artificial difficulty, and especially an artificial difficulty that has low consequences, right? If I quit in that run, if I give up in that run, that's very low consequence compared to difficulties in our real life. That can be very helpful. So what I argue is that we can use sport, we can use athletics to cultivate this mindfulness, this Stoic practice in a way that is simulating high difficult events with none of the consequence. It's the basic picture.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear.
If I could weigh in just a second, because I just find this so fascinating. At the moment, because I teach at a university, I teach at New York University, and I'm struck by how powerfully the culture in general, but particularly the culture of higher education in America, is going in exactly the opposite direction to what you're describing. That they are cultivating hyper reactivity. They're training people to sort of take offense. They almost give them training in what they should be offended by, how offended they should be by it, on behalf of other people, sometimes not even themselves. So they're actually sensitive for other people on top of themselves. And the idea of meritocracy is being warped into some elitist, perverted notion that sort of excludes people that haven't had the opportunity to develop so-called merit. So it's sort of anti-meritocratic, it's anti-stoic, it's hyper-reactionary. It's saying if there's too much space between the stimuli and the response, you're almost like morally lax, that you didn't figure out, that the moral clarity wasn't there immediately, that you knew it was wrong and you should take offense and you should take up arms. So the reason why I'm so compelled by this conversation and why I'm really eager to talk to you today is that everything you're saying makes perfect sense to me and just seems fundamentally sound. I'm curious why you think the culture, at least in the Western world, seems to be going in exactly the opposite direction.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting topic. And I think this has a lot to do with our views of ethics and the way emotions relate into ethics, right? I mean, one thing you hit on, which I think was beautifully put, is that there's this kind of ethical clarity or this kind of righteousness to being angry in the right way at the right time, at the right kind of immediacy. And this is something Aristotle talks about, right? So Aristotle talks about there's to be an ethical person is to feel the right way at the right time for the right reasons, right? So there's this view of like, if you're walking down the street and there's somebody that needs help and you help them, but you help them begrudgingly, you're not happy to do that. There's something lacking in your ethics. And I think there's some legitimacy to that, or at least that's like, Aristotelian ethical theory is very popular. But I think what we're seeing in my view, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm happy to discuss this together. I think what you've seen is a tone policing and a delegitimization of certain emotions or certain responses in the past. And now there is an overcompensation or an over lifting up or valuing, in the 70s, I would have got angry for this and there would have been no space to be angry for this. And that was a wrong. So now we're going to make a lot of space to be angry for this. And what more than that, because people have felt pain in having their anger delegitimized in the past, we are now going to be very cautious or very minimalistic in the kind of anger that we judge or police. And it's this kind of, I guess you can kind of have this innocent until proven guilty view, right? Which is like the Stoic perspective is like, better I not get angry at many things that I should be angry at than let in an inappropriate anger that then corrupts and rots me from the inside. And I suppose this other view would be something along the lines of, better I get angry at many things that don't deserve my anger than to not express anger at something that deserved it at the right time, right? So they're two very different approaches. My general view on this is that anger has a cognitively disrupting effect, such that you can't, even if you want to help, you can't help the best you can when you're angry. And it is not necessary for motivation. So there's another view that, like, if you're not upset about it, you're not going to mobilize, you're not going to make change. I don't think I agree with that view of human psychology. But yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, I would even add that one of the words that gets used a lot by the students that I am exposed to is exhaustion. They're constantly talking about how they're exhausted. And I'm sure it might even be adrenal fatigue, I don't know. But they are constantly struggling with their mental health. It's devastating to watch. They frequently feel they can't function at all. They need to drop out for long periods of time. They feel very brittle, and they communicate in the language of frailty a lot. And so just last week, I was discussing Stoicism with my class, and they all kind of leaned in. Like I was giving them a drink of water and they hadn't drunk in a long, long time. They were very, very curious about it. And it broke my heart.
Yeah, I find this stuff kind of fascinating because it's a supplied issue. I think, as we talked about, I think the cultivation of hyperreactivity is going to be, I'm comfortable in saying that that's incorrect, because you want to be cautious. Emotions, passions, extreme feelings, they have, one of the things Stoic talked about, they made another sport analogy. He said, like, getting upset is like running downhill. And the problem is that you cannot change, even if you know you shouldn't run anymore, or they're like, okay, come back up. It takes you a while to slow down, right? The momentum carries you. So the Stoics were always talking about how there is these kind of downstream negative effects to a inappropriate emotional judgment. And so if you get elevated, if you get in that state, it influences your ability to be rational in the future. It interferes with your ability to make sound judgments in the future. So I think hyper reactivity, where you're disposed to be constantly in this emotionally charged, I say triggered, but not in like the, just like, like constantly emotionally fraught state, it's not good. Even if the world around you is terrible, even if the world around you is accurate, your judgments are accurate, I think there needs to be a kind of a cautiousness about which of those you let in, and a self-preservation and an intentionality. So when you talk about people being, students leaning into Stoicism, or students, that sounds to me like people who haven't been taught that skill set and have been missing that skill set. So then you're having people who are not angry intentionally, are not cultivating that as a motivational anger, as a kind of righteous anger. They're people who are left with that as their default setting. And that is not a good default setting, because of, as we talked about, the other negative effects of it. So totally on board there. I think, the Stoics are going to say there's never an appropriate time to be angry. I understand that's an extreme view. I don't think most people will adopt that, but I guess we could probably agree on the view that being reactionary and being prone to emotional turbulence should not be your default position. It's something that you employ strategically when the moment calls for it.
I'm going to bring us slightly back to the conversation that was getting close to the physicality stuff, let's say. And it was in along this stimulus and response again. Inside the body and the movement world, there would be like one of these giant shoulders that we stand upon. His name is Moshe Feldenkrais. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he would also discuss or bring up the stimulus and response idea. He was a badass black belt judoka as well. So
Cool.
of course, as well, by the way, he gets to see this the relevance to the stimulus and response thing. And then I think, again, what I'm seeing, when like part of my image of you, Michael, is that of like a double helix, in that there seems to be, there doesn't seem to be, there definitely is. You've received a PhD in Stoicism, so your intellectual pursuit next to your black belt in Jiu-Jitsu has run parallel to your physical pursuit, which I kind of, my bias is that this is an essential part of human education across the board. And I see somewhere along the lines it seemed to have split, where maybe a specialization in intellectualizing things and not practicing. And then in some ways you have this hyper engagement in physical pursuits, but ignoring the intellectual. And I think there's something of deep significance for perhaps the Western culture, but just in education in general, that those two things walk in parallel, like 50-50 pretty much. But this stimulus and response thing we're talking about, I think ultimately what we're talking about this space between the thing that happened and what you do afterwards. And we want to space that out, but we're not spacing it out in time, really. It's like, because it's still this like nanosecond, millisecond space, but it's just our ability to choose what to do within that period, which is probably closer to our neuroplasticity, our brain's ability to make a decision and act upon it, which is most likely best developed physically. It seems to be the case anyway in the neuroscience, is that to develop neuroplasticity requires complex physical engagement, which brings me then to the validity of, I suppose, in bias to our podcast, play in general, but also something that you can probably relate to is jiu-jitsu. So I know myself, I'm a blue belt at this stage, and I can see my progress in jiu-jitsu is in the development of that space between stimulus and response. A guy does something, I have no idea what he's doing. It's like, what's he doing? I spaz out, and then I'm tapping 2 minutes later because I can't breathe, it's choking me. As time goes on, that someone does the same thing I've seen them do before. I know how this goes, I'll step this way, now I've got mount. I'm not choking this time. It was the same period of time where that person did the initial movement, but just through repetition, I became familiar. I created an adaptive response, and no, I'm not choking anymore. So repeat this, rinse and repeat this over 5, maybe 15 years. And not only have you got, I think, a neuroplastic brain that can use it in the context of jiu-jitsu, but in the real world, like, I'll give you another example. I have a daughter, she's approaching 6 months and she's a wee baby. And we're just putting her onto her solid foods at the moment. And I had her chewing on a bit of crusty bread the other day. And she bit a bit off, it went back her throat and she started to gag. So I grabbed onto her, I would be comfortable holding onto her body, patted, no such joy, reached in, got the bit of bread and pulled it out. I look across at my baby's mama and she's like, just her jaw is almost on the floor, wide-eyed. And she was having an absolute freak out. Whereas in that moment, I didn't break a rhythm to it, like. And then the same thing happened to Karen when I wasn't there. And she came up to the room afterwards. She managed to do the thing I did, but rattled. And I think, and she says to me, how did you stay so calm? And I said, jiu-jitsu, baby. And I don't think she understood. She kind of gets what I'm talking about when I say that, but I hear that quite a bit, that you see the jiu-jitsu players going, it's jiu-jitsu, it's jiu-jitsu. But like, I think only the people within maybe the martial arts world can completely understand the relevance of that statement when it comes to navigating the stimulus and response thing. And then just to go further, just since I touched on play, again, to the bias of the podcast and our proposition that play in general may have a value to our culture at large, is that in play, there's far less skin in the game. Well, depending on the games, of course, you play. Let's say we're just talking about general play, and that events of spontaneity occur. And should it go pear-shaped and you lose the game or make the error, so what? It's a low-stress situation. The more a person is playing these games, the more familiar they become with this type of impulse, the more familiar they become with them, and like, oh, well, it's not a risk so much, like nothing really, I didn't die. So they get to play with that space inside that stimulus and response. And I'm of the attitude that that's, well, I'm pretty sure that the neuroscientists would back me up as well, to say that in and of itself develops this neuroplasticity, which develops the opportunity to decide what is an appropriate action post-stimulus. Going back to jiu-jitsu, do you see that you have an insight into Stoicism and philosophy in general that perhaps your peers didn't have, courtesy of your, I suppose, virtually lifelong athleticism or pursuit of physical development in that of the art of jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, great. Okay, there was a lot of parts beforehand though that I wanted to hit on too, because you said a lot of really interesting things. So that's okay. So to pull some stuff back, to bring some ancient Greek stuff in this. So the ancient Greeks had this word techne, which is where we get technology. And it was this idea of a craft, right? So they viewed philosophy as a kind of a techne of life. So it's a craft of life. And they, you would look at the kind of the techne of basket weaving or the techne of being an architect, or so living was viewed as kind of a skill, a craft that you practice and you develop, right? This was not like, it wasn't like there's sport and then there's everything else, right? So I guess to connect that right at the end, I think a mastery of anything, becoming good, I'm sure great musicians also feel this, or, novelists or something like this. I think what's really important is becoming good at something. So learning how to develop a craft, perfect or get close. I'm not perfect, but become excellent at a techne. And then you're like, this is how I cultivate skill, and this is how I develop a craft. That's one of the biggest things jiu-jitsu has given me. And I apply that to everything. And I apply that to my philosophy, to my research, and then I apply that to my personal practice of Stoicism. This is another craft. This is another skill I'm developing. And then there was this discussion you have of kind of experiential knowledge, I would say. So you made this divide between the body and the intellect, but for me, and I don't know if these are different, I don't know if I'm hitting on something different here. For me, it's this view of, propositional knowledge. So like the statement X is the case, and then experiential knowledge of like being in it. Like this proposition, like, when my child is in danger, I should like navigate that situation calmly. And then this like kind of experiential knowledge of doing it and how to do it. And those things are, I think one thing that jiu-jitsu teaches you, you talk about the separation, but I think in any sport, it teaches you about implementing the intellectual into the physical and about the incapacity to separate those two, right? That person that can list all the jiu-jitsu techniques, it doesn't really matter, right? You require your capacity to implement those in difficult moments. And as you talked about, a big part of jiu-jitsu practice, is the coach shows a technique. And then that's kind of that intellectual knowledge of like, okay, that's what an armbar is. That's how I choke somebody. And then you go and you practice and you develop and you implement it. And that's gaining this kind of experiential knowledge of how to put it into work. So that's something that I think I gained, is this kind of incapacity to separate those two, or a lack of interest in separating those two. Because you see a lot of people that study philosophy, they essentially become historians of philosophy. Or I had this conversation with someone else recently. They're reading and talking about philosophy, but they're not doing philosophy, right? Mm-hmm. Doing philosophy is the practice of the techne of living well. And the practice of a techne is involving the combination of that kind of intellectual knowledge with the experiential, practical, applied knowledge. And this is something that the Greeks were very, very in tune with, right? And Aristotle puts this applied knowledge as the highest good, and the goal of cultivating virtue is about moving from the intellectual to that capacity to apply it in the moment when it matters. And then one thing that the Greeks hit on is this importance of, just doing. So Epictetus has these wonderful lines about, if you want to become a runner, you need to run. If you want to become a carpenter, you need to do carpentry. It's this very simple thing about you become what you do and the importance of that. Now, there was just so many interesting ideas you hit, so I'm trying to run through those all. I'm curious if I can throw a question back at you about what role you think play has and how you separate play from competition or practice.
Oh, cool question, man.
Well, can I jump in there while you're still contemplating it? Because I'm fascinated by this issue too.
Right on.
We are still trying to figure out what this podcast is, in a way. And we've thought a lot about the value of play and particularly its relationship to neuroplasticity. And it seems to me that one of the key virtues in the ancient Greek world that cultivates excellence is sticking with a thing and getting better at it, like you say, developing a craft. And it's an ancient and honorable idea that you focus on one thing and you spend your whole life doing it and you become a master. And it's a romantically appealing idea. But one of the things the 21st century seems to pitch at people is it's a highly volatile, rapidly shifting environment. And one of the things we value most is the ability to learn how to learn. So not cultivating a craft, but just be able to drop into any environment, like some special forces, like a cognitive equivalent to a special forces guy, and just adapt to that new environment. So when we're talking about play, it's a weird thing because I can see a person spending 15, 20 years of their life becoming good at jiu-jitsu and becoming a master and going deep down that well. And that has value. And I don't know if the play that we're most interested in is the play of going further and further into one game or being able to translate skills across games. I don't know which is more important. And that's one of the things I'm really curious about. I don't know what Robbie's going to jump in with here.
Yeah. So like I would never, as I stand at the moment, stack anything of importance in a hierarchical sense. So I don't think play above competition nor play above performance. I think all are like equally as important to as individuals. Perhaps play is the one thing, maybe again a bias of mine, that is less invested in because there's far less merits or recognition to be received from. Like I just came back from playing, oh bravo, but I just came back from a competition. I just came back from a competition and I won. Excellent. I just came back from a competition and I lost. Well done all the same. I just came back from my practice. I'm taking things seriously. Look at me go. Bravo. But play, we seem to be considered silly. Whereas it's age old and it goes across the animal kingdom. So there's an importance there to it. Like, I mean, it's been considered, I think it was Einstein said that, like the highest form of research. I really like that, in that we can learn through a playful manner, both physically and intellectually. And like it's the master craftsman carpenter, how can have a playful element to his craft, less skin in the game in a way in this learning element of it. So I'll elaborate a small bit more on this. In my movement center or in my workshops, I utilize play as a means both to get a person to develop their own physical intellect, to like have an almost introspective approach to how they're going about the task that I'm proposing. I propose a task. It might be a complex task. Stand on one leg, touch this, and avoid this person who's coming with their hand. It's deliberately designed so that the person more than likely will fail first attempt, reevaluate their approach and modify accordingly. And in this space of modification and trial and error is what's called and it will be like there'll be a biochemical cocktail going off inside the brain to create the environment for neuroplasticity. Now, we didn't pre-qualify or explain what the term neuroplasticity was to nor Michael, should he not know, nor the audience. But if I were to do my best at making it simple, it's creating a means to which the brain becomes adaptive. It changes the wiring of the brain. So basically the brain, let's say, at a particular is wired here's how things are done. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, the things aren't done that way. Reconfigure and try, oh, it's done this way. This is pretty much it rewires the brain. But repetition of this rewiring actually makes the brain more flexible at doing the exact same thing. So modifying in real time how we do things. So it can move a brain that would be like, let's say, binary, this or not this, to be more flexible. It could be this, or this. And in the meantime, I've become skilled at navigating across the board without without a stress stimulant or a strain stimulus. So we talked about stimulus and response. It is, I think, the neuroscientific name of that space in and of itself, or creating that widening of that space. So play as a means of personal physical development, I think, and it seems to be the case, develops this neuroplastic event, as well as this introspection of what's going on, and I'll also say not directly, it's indirectly. So Michael, if you were to show up to my workshop and we're playing these games, at no moment are you going to be self-reflecting on how neuroplastic your brain is. You know, you're too busy caught up in the playing, interacting with another person, having a good time, and you leave the event, hopefully, if I've done my job right, after forming some connections both internally and to other players. So I hope I've answered your question in that, like I'm saying, I think it's complementary to competition and practice, but definitely not superior, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I have something to learn. Well, obviously I have something to learn, but I think I'm quite interested in learning from you two right now. If I can bring a couple more questions back at you, not to turn this around, but I'm just very curious. So if I'm understanding correctly, the view is something like neuroplasticity is beneficial. It's something that can be cultivated through certain things. It can be cultivated through play, and it puts us in a better position it's something that we want for its own sake, and it puts us in a better position to achieve other ends. And so, we're using play as a method to achieve this desirable thing, something like this. I'm interested in this idea then of why play is why it's associated with children. I mean, is this kind of what you're pushing back against? Is that like, that's a mistake and that we should like reincorporate it for adults? Or because another thing that I'm thinking about when you're talking is I'm thinking about what's the difference between play and practice, right? So I have people, I wouldn't say, okay, come and practice jiu-jitsu versus come and play jiu-jitsu. Sometimes I play jiu-jitsu, but when I play jiu-jitsu, it's probably like non-goal oriented, right? So it's like, and it's experimental. So I'm going to like create things, and it's, as I said, not skin in the game. It's non-judgmental because it's non-goal oriented. You can't fail because there's no goal that you're trying to achieve. And we don't do that very much, right? We always come to practice, and the practice is you're working on something. And I would think of moral education as practice, right? I'm trying to become more courageous. I have a task. Okay, I failed at that task because I was cowardly, but I'm not going to give myself too hard of a time. So I'm like, I'm not going to give myself too hard of a time. I'm going to be forgiving of myself, but I was still practicing and I still failed. So I'm interested in I guess a couple questions is, why has this been, if this is beneficial, why has it been culturally constrained to children, A, and B, what would moral play look like? And is that possible, or is that something you're imagining?
That's a good question, man. I mean, I think for the first question about why is it constrained to children, I think it's to do with an economics of energy. Like, I'm reading Daniel Lieberman's Exercise. This is a Harvard professor of physiology that's trying to study what exercise is and why we do it, seeing as it's so unnatural. And one of the things he notes, your cat has reminded me of this actually. He says, if I drive my car to the park and I open the door of the car, and you can see this with other cars at the park, the first thing to spring out of the car will be the family Labrador or golden retriever, boom, it just wastes all its energy because it's not planning for the future. It has no future. It just lives in the present. So it just spends all its energy and then it's exhausted in 20 minutes. The next thing to burst out of the car are the kids. They run screaming out of the car. Lots of noise, lots of movement. And then slowly the dad or the mom gets out of the car and locks up and monitors the situation, because they're doling out their daily energy. They can't spend it all at once. They have an agenda. And so I guess the more agenda driven we are, the more we're into the economy of our energy. We want to invest in labor that's going to result in some kind of return that we understand. And it's like it's an investment. So I think that one of the reasons why, and this could be circular, this could be a chicken and egg problem. People don't have a surplus of energy, so they don't play. But I think Robbie's insight is you don't have a surplus of energy because you don't play. And I think that's a profound insight.
Yeah, I'll go with that. Yeah. I remember reading a book. I think it was Homo Ludens by Huizinga, which is on play in itself. I think it was in that one. And it was talking about the spontaneous impulse to engage in play or dance comes from having the vitality surplus to begin with. So that spoke to me in a way that it was saying that perhaps we don't play as adults today because everybody is so exhausted, or because there is such a lack of vitality across the board that even like the desire or will to play in and of itself is out of sight. And then perhaps we can cap it then and explain away our lack of desire to play and say, it's just for kids. I have more important things to do. And I have yet to see a person who shows up and ends up playing that considers it a bad idea for doing so. I've never once seen it. And it's funny because it's such a difficult sell. It's such a difficult sell. Hey, Michael, show up here and play. I got stuff to do, man.
Well, because it doesn't achieve a goal, right? Is the idea. Like it doesn't feed into that economy loop, at least not immediately, right?
Yeah, unless people, I suppose if we do our job quite well, and we start in our investigation of play and detailing the value in it, then perhaps this can become closer to the social narrative, and we appreciate the value of play, providing we're on the money or on the ball.
Yeah, exactly right. Because this idea that you're asking, what would moral play look like? And I think the answer is art, right? People construct malevolent entities, and then we watch how people interact with them. We call them villains, or we engage in these ways of doing things that are very dark and test our sense of who we really are, like the fact that we enjoy seeing evil play out in front of us. So we kind of understand that art is useless, or it's very deeply non-pragmatic, but that's its core value to society, that it is a form of like moral or amoral play. But people kind of understand art because we've had it for so long. But what we're proposing here is something like the psychophysical equivalent of art, which is this thing that we don't know what to call it, so we're just calling it play. But I think it's in the same vein. Does that sound right to you, Robbie, or is that off?
No, that sounds right on to me. And also, I don't want to skip across the part where you brought up, Michael, we don't show up to BJJ to play, not necessarily. Even though, if I'm correct, your BJJ are called BJJ players, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So what came to my mind was like a real turning point for me in developing jiu-jitsu was when my professor, Liam Beechner of BJJ Cork, said to me, Robbie, the mats are the lab. And that's where we experiment. And I think he walked away, and I think I might have been still staring into space for 5 minutes afterwards. It was a game-changing event for me because I used to have to I have my cup of coffee, I get myself psyched up. I'm going upstairs now for the next hour or 2 hours. I'm going to be fighting dudes. It's going to be bigger guys, more experience. I'm fighting these dudes. I'm fighting them and then all of a sudden, I think I signed up for a competition, and Liam put it to me, this is the lab, this is where we experiment. And it was a game changer for me. I still bring it up to him every now and then. And then as the further I go into play, I'm experimentation is play, if I think about it. And when I reflect on my childhood, I was always interested in experiments. I remember setting up in the bath different tubs and boxes just to pour the water in and see what way it flows to make something else move. Just experimenting in general was interesting to me. But I watched a podcast with George St. Pierre and Joe Rogan, And George St. Pierre is like almost like an icon or idol of mine in regards to he's like a real living legend in that of like a purist martial artist still surviving inside our time. And he said to Joe Rogan, when I show up to training, I don't ask my teammates to spar. He said, I ask them to play. So he proposed to him, you want to play with me? So then it changes the theme in a way of how he engages. He did say then also, if someone says you want to fight, you want to spar, he goes, okay, man. You know, it's George St. Pierre, like you don't want to provoke that guy. But then it made me feel comfortable to almost embody a more playful approach to my development of jiu-jitsu. So when I do engage at the moment lately in jiu-jitsu, I'm getting far less injured because I'm approaching it playfully. Like I'm 38 years of age. I'm not winning any world titles, and I'm happy. Like I said to my coach, I want to be doing jiu-jitsu at 50, maybe even 60. So I need to conduct myself accordingly. And if I approach my skills acquisition in a playful manner, I think it's far less likely that I'm going to get hurt in doing so. And there is a good likelihood. I find that I'm developing my skills more, and my resistance to show up to training has dramatically decreased. And that's not to say that if I end up in a situation where I'm sparring someone who is bringing it and they want to take my head, then I'll rise to the occasion and do my very best to meet them where they're at. But I come with the intentionality to play jiu-jitsu at the moment.
Yeah, I think one thing that you're hitting on, which is important, and you've defended it twice, because I think perhaps you're pushing back against a misconception about play, is that being playful does not mean being inept. So there was the GSP example, and there was your example of like, I come to play, but like I can also, you know, if push comes to shove, I can also not play. And I think that's important, but I think that does come. I don't know if you, I certainly, you don't think that, but I think other people might think that, is that there's this kind of uselessness to play, or this inaptitude with play. And again, I think it connects to the juvenileness. And I hope it's okay to pull this conversation in this direction, just with my philosophy training. I really like the conceptual distinctions. We don't talk about sport much in the philosophy area. I really like that discussion of moral play as movies and art and film. But then I wanted to make the distinction between play versus entertainment. And I was interested in the divide between that. And then the other thing that you were hitting on, Robbie, was this idea of bringing play into non-playful spaces. So there seems to be something radical in what GSP does, which is not like, there's this thing of like, I'm going to go to the park and I'm going to play with the kids. And that's like entering a playful space. But what he's doing is he's entering TriStar, he's entering one of the best MMA training spaces in the world, and he's saying, will you play with me? And that there's something different. That seems to me to be a different project than a workshop, for example, where you're saying, come play with me, and people recognize it as a playful space. Whereas this person is like trying to change the space they're in. I think there's something interesting there to the value to that.
Yeah, what I like about what you're saying to me is something that Colin will probably articulate far better than I will, so I'll set him up. It's that of almost like the metaphysical playground. You know, not necessarily do you have to go to a particular fixed place for it to be a playground. Ultimately, the playground is wherever you want it to be, providing you choose to enter it. So in this case, like in TriStar, George St. Pierre is proposing to his teammate, would you like to play with me? And should his playmate accept, or teammate accept, then effectively they both enter their own little microcosm that is the playground there and then within that location. So it's closer, I think, to an attitude than it is a place. That like a kid can go out their back garden. Colin's done many examples of this, where they can pick up a stick and all of a sudden they're a wizard. And it's just completely imaginative. Like a lot of what we do in life is imaginative. We imagine ourselves as all sorts of roles in life. So I hope I'm answering your question with that, and I hope I'm setting you up, Colin, if you have something to follow on from what I said.
Yeah. Well, you asked about the distinction between art and entertainment, and I think this is preeminent among my colleagues because I teach at the Tisch School of Arts. So we're always trying to figure out what art even is. But I think it's something, what distinguishes art from entertainment is, this may be a facile distinction, I'm sure there's lots of exceptions, but it's the element of challenge, I think. that art is an invitation to enter into conceptual engagement with the thing in front of you. It requires interpretation, and it requires that you set down a lot of your presuppositions and start to kind of really listen to an alien mind, whereas entertainment is made to give you what you already are back to you and placate you in some way. And I think that one of the reasons why it's valuable to think about play, like one of the things that is unhelpful about play in English is that we don't have a good lexicon for play. I know that at least the Greeks had at least 2 words for play: paida, which meant children's play, where they just run around kind of making stuff up out of the blue. It's like Calvin ball. And then ludens is more like a specific idea of rule-governed play that you can achieve mastery in, that you can keep getting better and better and better at it. And so I guess that art is sort of straddles these 2 worlds, that you can make things up out of the blue, but then it also has a harmony or an order that you can get better and better at engaging with, either as a consumer or as a producer. So I wish that we had a better lexicon. I think that what's unhelpful is that we just have this word called play, and it covers way too many things, and we're just all meant to understand what we mean in any given context.
Yeah, that's great. I might make a bit of a reach here, but bear with me because I'm finding this very interesting, and it's like connecting some dots in my head.
Good.
So Milan Kundera, are either of you familiar with him as a writer? He makes he's a Czech writer. He's quite old now, so probably born in the 30s or 40s, and he kind of grew up in Russian occupied, I think it was Czechoslovakia, but Eastern Europe. And he ended up having to emigrate because the conditions were quite bad. And he writes a lot about the harms of, perhaps not communism, but at least like, Soviet control in this kind of political state. And one thing he talks about, which made me think about your distinction between art and entertainment, which is he talks about the distinction between art and propaganda. And propaganda is attempting to communicate a thesis. So propaganda says, this is the way the world is, absorb this, believe this. And art promotes ambiguity. So art is, you watch at the end of a great movie and it's like, was that person the good guy or the bad guy? And you can actually go and argue and disagree about it. Where a bad movie, you're like, no, that's the villain, clearly. Mm-hmm. And that's the hero, right? There's no ambiguity here. It's very clear that this is the way that people want us to live our lives. And so one of his points about that, his first book is called The Joke, and it's about a person who makes a joke in this like Soviet state and ends up like losing their job and getting in big trouble for it. Because the point is that there's no room for humor in this kind of political state, because there's no room for the ambiguity that's implicit in humor, right? And I mean, I typically connect this with ancient Greek thought, right? Because what Socrates does is Socrates, he engages in a dialogue with people. This is the Socratic dialogue, the Socratic method. And the point of his dialogue is Socrates, again, so not an ancient Greek philosophy podcast, so let me back up a bit. Socrates, basically the founder of ancient Greek philosophy. There's some pre-Socratics before him, but the fact that they're called pre-Socratics show that he's a pretty important guy. And he had this method, it's called the Socratic method, where people would come and they would be like, oh, I'm going to, Euthyphro is this dialogue where somebody goes, I'm going to tell the police about my father because my father's being impious. He's committing sacrilege against the gods. And Socrates goes, wow, that's interesting. You must really know what it means to be pious or not pious if you're willing to like get your dad in trouble for that, right? And the guy's like, yeah, I do. And he's like, let's talk about it. And they have a conversation, and he basically pulls apart this person's conception of justice and injustice, or piety and impiety. And Socrates' method is to pull out, in a way, I would say it's a kind of intellectual play. I've not thought about the philosophy of play before, but it's a kind of intellectual play where you're saying there's no objective here. There's no like let's just explore, let's experiment, let's try to see if we can get to this conclusion. And what he's doing is he's promoting ambiguity. And what I typically say is that philosophy, art, humor, these are antithetical to the political, the propaganda, the I guess the entertainment, the non-ambiguous, the set in stone, the very specific, and these are the ambiguous. And I would say that, if I had to put play somewhere, I would put it in that. And that's a kind of intellectual play, I guess, is dialogue, conversation, and as opposed to debate, let's say, or as opposed to persuasion, right?
Yeah.
So that's interesting to me.
Yeah, actually, Socrates is a fascinating character because he seems to have this boundless appetite for play. He's kind of grabbing people on the street and going, "Hey, buddy, want to have a conversation?" And you can see in some of the dialogues they're trying to get away. They're like, "You know what? I just realized I'm really late to something. I have to go." Like they realize he's playing this game and they can't play it well, and it's not going well for them. So it's not fun, and they're trying to disengage. And ultimately, and this might not be very promising for Robbie and me, challenging play ends up with them going, "Let's kill that
guy." You don't like this, yeah.
He's asking too many weird questions, and he's kind of slowing down the pace of things in some way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it connects again to this economics, which is this idea of like, I'm very intentional, very purposeful for what I'm doing, and things that then disrupt that kind of the process of that kind of economy of action are harmful to someone who's invested in it, right? And there's going to be a pushback from people invested in that. Yeah, but for those that don't know, as you were alluding to, Socrates ends up being convicted of impiety against the gods by the state of Athens. But he's a really hilarious character. I just like to dig into this a bit because basically they have a vote of a jury if you're guilty, and then after that you propose. So he gets convicted of guilty, and then he proposes a punishment, and the prosecution proposes a punishment, and his punishment is like, I've actually done such an amazing thing for you by engaging in this philosophy and this play with you. I propose as my punishment that you honor me as Olympic champion and you give me free meals for the rest of my life. And the other guys, the prosecutor's like, well, I propose death. And they're like, well, we can't give you that. So we punish you to death. And he actually has more people voting him to death than the people that voted him guilty. Because of how it's a second vote and how ridiculous his proposition was. But he's an interesting character. And if you're interested in Stoicism, all of that ancient philosophy kind of flows from him. And he's really, really unique character to look more into.
Yeah, it's almost like Robbie and I have endlessly ended up talking about the trickster. It feels like every third conversation we have ends up bringing up the trickster character. And the value of the trickster is some sort of irreducible play element woven into the fabric of existence, that you're trying to build an order. You're trying to make everything clear and coherent and consistent. And it's a perfectly noble and rational thing to do. And then this thing shows up and just goes, it's the Bugs Bunny of the universe that just kind of flips everything around on the Elmer Fudd of your life. And it just goes, no, you're a good person, but I'm going to mess with you today. And you just have to be able to handle it. So in a way, I think Stoicism somewhat suffers from a PR problem. There's something very serious and knitted brow quality to it. And it'd be like, no, just know that this little trickster thing, this irreducible element of chaos shows up. It's the normal state of affairs, actually. And if you can handle it and roll with that, your life is going to be so much more intelligent and interesting and compelling to you than if you just are a very serious person that thinks you know what's going on and you're holding on tight.
Yeah, I might be stretching this a bit, but allow me to, I'm going to try my best. Perhaps the Stoic perspective is the only perspective in which you can play, or maybe not the only one, but a perspective that allows play. Because as you said, if you hold too tight, you can't play, right? Because you're committed to consequences. You're committed to being very committed to what happens external to you, right? So it becomes a competition. And then if it's not a competition, it becomes a practice for the competition that matters. But it's only when you allow, you become like water, you become the rock in the water that allows things to flow around you. Can you allow that play with your life, the kind of moral play, the kind of personal play that comes with like, this might go differently than I expected it to, and that's okay. And I'm going to embrace that kind of ambiguity and chaos. As you said, the push for order is a rejection that that's a natural part of the world, and it's an attempt to limit the chaos as much as possible. Or I suppose the jester, the player, is comfortable existing in that or accepting it, if not even attempting to produce it because of its beneficial side effects.
Yeah, I mean, my daughter at the moment, she's just turning 10, and we send her to improv classes, comedy. Improv. And so they're just thrown into situations. They're given a random set of constraints, and then they have to adapt to the constraints instantaneously. And to me, it's like, I can't see any difference between that and jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, I'm trying to think this back to I have to think about play and maybe incorporating more play. I mean, one thing I know that we do is we do it all the time with the kids, right? We recognize with the kids, we have a really great, strong children's program where I'm from, and we don't make these people do jiu-jitsu at all, right? You're like, okay, you're like, you're wrestling, or you got to try to crawl to the other side of the room, and Jimmy's going to try to stop you. And all of a sudden Jimmy's doing better jiu-jitsu than if you told Jimmy to practice jiu-jitsu. All of a sudden he's figuring, he's like, I know how to pin this person and I know how to do all this stuff. Because you're I don't know, you're recontextualizing it. And we do that all with kids until they're like, 8. You're doing nothing but playing, nothing about, roll around on the ground for a bit, get comfortable. Or one of the things we do at our club, or my father's club, is there's kind of this free time at the start of class. And we talk about play being constrained to kids, but there's not much opportunity for supervised play. Maybe they're like having crazy time in recess. Yeah. But at gym class, you're doing a sport, like, right? You're doing like, try to get that ball in the net. And what we do is like, here's a matted area. Here's some adults watching you so nobody gets hurt, and like, just go. And these kids they create their own games. They create their own, and that freedom of having a mat so they can do jiu-jitsu, they can wrestle, they can tackle each other, they can pin each other down. There's a real benefit to that. And there's a real freedom to that. And I guess we get there with open mat, we get there with free practice in jiu-jitsu, but there's this analogy between jiu-jitsu and play, but I think what I'm walking away from this conversation with is something a bit more radical about, like, maybe incorporating more play, as I understand it, into the way that I approach my jiu-jitsu, which is, perhaps a bit like practice and a bit like competition. But I'll have to chew on that a bit.
Yeah, I'd love to see a complete overhaul of the education system, because what you're talking about, supervised play, or someone is setting certain constraints, but it's encouraging the acquisition of certain aptitudes that can be cultivated over time. That education properly understood would be games that get more complex and more interesting. That should be the goal. And I don't know why it's not, and it drives me crazy that it isn't.
I think also something that's worthy of mentioning is the inhibitory element of the fear of doing it wrong or being wrong. So the lack of willingness to engage and express actual potential just because of the fear itself of being wrong can be eliminated through adding in this playful attitude or playful context.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like, so Stoicism is, you get around the fear of doing wrong by internalizing the fact that other people's judgment of you is not representative of you, is not harmful to you, does not matter. So it's this kind of like intellectual way of internalizing a truth. You work from principles down, and perhaps play could be this bottom up way of coming to the same spot of like, I've now done this a lot. I know it because I've seen how much better I am and how much more fun I have and how much better my life is when I internalize this. Yeah. So you're arriving at a similar spot where playfulness is possible, but obviously two different. Go ahead.
Oh no, sorry, I didn't interrupt.
Oh no.
I know that famously the Greeks came up with the splitting of theoria and praxis. So in a way, Stoicism understood one way has this theoretical, top-down component to it, which is, here's the roadmap for what it would look like if you were doing it right. Here are the basic principles or operating principles you should be using. Play is our word maybe for the praxis of that, right? That if you can roll, and keep rolling and adapting, then that's the test. Robbie called it the lab, but that's the test, the testing ground to see if you really got it in your bones. Yeah.
And this might lead us into talking about your app, Michael, because I want to make sure that this comes up. Because of the nature of it seems to me that the journaling is right there within Stoicism. I was journaling years before I realized it was a tool used by the Stoics. I was journaling years before I even realized it was a tool. My introduction to journaling was actually writing down my exercise programs. So I would have just had a journal with me in the gym And then as I was training, expressing myself, perhaps blowing off some steam, some clarity would come to the front, and I would just be, well, that's worth noting. And then, oh, that's worth noting. I do that. And then I could look at my behaviors in training and relate them to my behaviors in the real world. And I suppose unintentionally arrived at self-reflection. But I think because we'd like to offer our listeners something that can be practically applied after listening to our conversations. And perhaps there is an integrative conversation we can have, or maybe you can tell me to feck off. Like, that's not how to journal, Robbie. But I think, like Colm being a writer, and you being a Stoic, and all of us here having this conversation with Stoicism and play, I get the impression that journaling in and of itself, this self-reflective practice, can have a playful element to it, because ultimately you're kind of like dancing with truth. We want to be true. We want to be truthful with ourselves, but that can be difficult and challenging. But we want to get as close to it as we can, I'd imagine, when we're journaling. So as to be like, oh yeah, I do that. What a fucking muppet, you know, or something along those lines. And I wonder then, first of all, just if you were to speak about journaling itself practically, and perhaps Colm, you might offer something to this. I know something you're quite skilled on. And then maybe that can lead us into you talking about your app, Michael, and how that could be utilized.
Sure. I mean, one thing I want to say right now is I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm learning just as much as I'm hopefully helping tell you guys about Stoicism. So it's been really fun and really cool. These are really interesting directions for me. So with the journaling, I think what we're finding now that I never thought about it this way before, but what we're finding is all these same kind of things. So non-judgment, right? Non-observation, experimentation. Journaling is very different than like blogging, for example, where you're putting this up for observation, you're feeling judgment. Perhaps you could mix those two, but it's this kind of personal practice. For the Stoics, as I said, so I think, yeah, it's absolutely playful in that regard, right? And that your journal can look like whatever you want it to be. There's prompts, but relates back to improv, right? With this prompt of like, okay, you're in a china shop and, this person has a baseball bat, go. And the prompt is just this is a quote, right? And it's like, it invites this kind of creativity in the direction you want to take it from. Another thing that we try to cultivate in journaling is consistency, right? So this recognition that like, it's not always going to be super insightful. It's not always going to be terribly, but just engage in the practice consistently. And again, I think that helps you move past self-judgment of like, oh, I had an interesting idea today. No, it's not about something like that. And then, I mean, so Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, right, is his journal, right? So one of the most famous Stoic texts we have is just a practicing Stoic engaging in the act of journaling. Another thing is that many of the Stoic texts, so Seneca and Epictetus, most of the ones that people will read are dialogue based, right? So Epictetus is a series of conversations he's having with students. Seneca is a series of letters back and forth with a friend of his. And I think there's something valuable or interesting here of thinking about, these aren't people, when they're doing Stoicism, when they're practicing Stoicism and they're teaching, they're not like writing down a list of rules. They're engaging collaboratively, dynamically with other people in conversations, either with others or with themselves or with truth, as you put it before. So there's something all connected there. And then, so I'm happy to run with that further. And then, so you mentioned the app. So for those listening, if you find Stoicism interesting, me and my partner, we have an app called Stoa. And this is basically a way to practice Stoicism. So Stoa is where the word Stoicism comes from. It's kind of a porch that, an ancient Greek porch where the Stoics would congregate. And again, we're getting back to this concept of like, it wasn't a classroom, right? It was a porch. And what the porch things is it's accessible, right? So it's non-judgmental. So it's like peer-to-peer instead of I sit at the front and you listen to me. And it's also, I guess it connects with accessible. It's open. People walk by, people walk in, people leave. Again, connecting with this idea, perhaps not of playfulness directly, but less structure. And so what Stoa is it's an app designed to help people practice Stoicism. So you have the theory and the praxis, lots of theory online. And we wanted to create something that helps with praxis. And so there's meditations on there, there's theory on there, and there's journaling on there. And another thing that we've been working is we've been doing live workshops. And I think the workshop connects with something that was missing, which is this idea of play, which is that if you're sitting and listening to an expert, you can get very much into like a student default zone. And I think that's not where good philosophy happens. I think good philosophy happens when you're asking questions, when you're discussing with people. So we've been running these kind of workshops where people can chat with each other. Happy to talk about more, but the basic problem to Phil is we wanted something that people could then practice Stoicism and improve themselves instead of just being like, that's intellectually interesting.
Yeah. Well, you were talking a little bit about, at the very start of our conversation, about a history professor that created a distinction between truth and importance. And that's good, because truth always has this kind of, there's an implication that it's objectively true, and importance is always subjective, right? So I'm thinking a little bit about Alfred North Whitehead, a logician of all people, who said that meaning, this word, it basically means an emotional experience we're having. We're saying this connection of ideas is significant. It's releasing some kind of emotional response to me that's saying, my intuition tells me this is important. And there's another, a psychologist, I think, called James Pennebaker, who found that people who journaled and were able to look back over their life events, but find new constructions or put together things that they hadn't put together before, to join up dots they hadn't joined up before, that improves health biomarkers for up to 6 months. Like, that's a profound effect to have. This play, we talk about the play of ideas, but we don't think about that seriously. Like, you are playing, you're being challenged by ideas that can, if you practice it enough, change your physical and mental health.
And can I jump in here? Is that?
Please, yes.
Yeah. I don't know if I necessarily got this from philosophy, but I always think about the importance of humans as narrative creatures and these stories we're constructing for ourselves. But one of the benefits of the Stoic view of emotions, which I talked about before, which is that you feel based on the way you think about the world. I mean, when could the stories we tell ourselves be more important than if you have that view of human psychology and human emotion? So like, a lot of people work with this kind of, there's this idea of kind of folk psychology, which is this way you think about the mind that isn't necessarily supported by neuroscience or any sort of personal psychological research. And I think a lot of people walk around with the view of these emotions are things to be suppressed, wrestled with, fought against, rather than manifestations of the stories we're telling ourselves. And, you know, if you're an angry person, it's because, as the Stoics say, it's this view that you're being harmed and it's someone else's fault. So it's this view that you've built into this story of your own fragility, your own capacity to be harmed by others, and you have this conception of other people, you know, then impacting that fragility. And that's a story you're telling yourself. That's a story about what you're valuing. That's a story about the kind of person you are. That's a story about how the kind of life events have contributed. And some of the most basic Stoic exercises are just story reconfigurations, right? So there's this exercise of the obstacle is the way, which is this idea of, I take some sort of a reframing, right? I take some sort of problem that's occurred to me and I reframe it as an opportunity to become better, right? So I talk about this in my writing, you know, someone's, you know, a real asshole, and it's like, oh, you're my sparring partner to deal with my anger. Thank you. You know, you're my sparring partner to deal with my capacity to be calm. I really appreciate you showing up and sparring with me so hard today. And, you know, that it sounds like a bit of an owl, but what it is it's a story reconstruction, right? You're the character. And what is that character enduring? What is happening to that character? Is that character being harmed by the antagonist, or is that character being aided by, you know, not a protagonist, but another character? And that's up to you, the way you tell that story. And that's incredibly empowering. And yeah, so I mean, what you're hitting on is that journaling gives us the capacity to see these pieces over time and gives us more freedom to rearrange, reconstruct, see connections we didn't see before. So, you know, I talk about that reframing, but, you know, if you're able to look back 4 months in the past and be like, wow, I was really stressed about that thing 4 months. I was really stressed about getting laid off 4 months ago, but now I'm in a job I'm happier than I ever was before. And then you can kind of see, wow, look at how upset I was 4 months ago and how well I'm doing now. And the next time you're that viscerally upset, because you have those pieces to fall back on, you can kind of remind yourself and say, oh, what's happening is just that kind of story again. That's a powerful tool to have. I think that's a nice way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's right on. Another thing, what came to mind when you're talking about this narrative deconstruction, I suppose, first of all, to observe the narrative, that can be a difficult thing to do, in that it's such a self-reflective exercise. But I know myself that we very rarely want to face the terms with, actually, maybe it's my fault, or maybe it's me. And then we can like kind of like almost take the scenic route to make, rather than face up the fact that it could possibly be me. And what I mean by that is, like, sometimes when I'm journaling, something I came up with a tool for myself was I look for the noble stowaway. So what I mean by that is that when I'm journaling and I'm writing something, I'm wondering, am I sneaking in some form of noble narrative that has placed me as the hero inside this situation, or the nobleman? And then I'll try and tear that apart, because what I'll find is that more often than not, that's horseshit. And that what I'm kind of being mindful of is where I'm being noble, let's say, or where I'm potentially the victim. And I think, like, my observation of the world is that I think the victim narrative has almost like got a lot of people by the throat, and that there's a narrative loop going on that has a person center of the story as being done hard by. So the reason I bring it up is that if we're offering our audience these tools that are just self-reflection and journaling, I think it's worthy mentioning perhaps some of these pitfalls that to look out for. And that is, like, I think if personally, if we are in this practice of self-reflection, be vigilant of the martyr, the victim, the nobleman, the hero, and just see how they show up along the way, and see if they're worthy of being torn apart, taking the sword.
Yeah, that's really good, Robbie. It's almost like you're being invited to be your own trickster and come along to your convenient narratives and go, how about no? You know, how about screw you and your very sad story? And what would happen if you played with your own interpretation of your life? Like, that's a really powerful, to become your own mercurial entity is really.
Yeah, I find as well also when I'm doing it, when there is some element of an emotive response, whether regardless of what that is, just this elevation, like, okay, there's something in and around here. I'll just stay here because I felt something.
Yeah, I don't know if I could say it any better. I think that's really, really valid and really important. Both the hero and the hard done by. I mean, a couple of points I want to hit on. Where that brings my thought to is David Foster Wallace, who's another writer. And he has this book, well, it's a speech called This is Water. But the basic point of that is that he looks at vice as an inability to maintain a kind of radical compassion that takes a lot of time and a lot of work. Excuse me. So the view is something like, sorry, one second. The view is something like, when I'm upset with someone else, I'm unable to conceive of them as a fully formed person with their own beliefs, motivations, problems. I'm centering myself as the hero of a story. And when this person is inconveniencing that story, I'm very frustrated. but they're their own hero. They're their own protagonist of their own very complex, important story. But the point with him is that that's very difficult to maintain that perspective. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of attention. And one of his last book, The Pale King, he actually ends up killing himself halfway through this book. So it's unfinished, but he looks at this idea of attention and mindfulness as a virtue. And he takes these characters, he's like, who are characters that can be very mindful? And he looks at like tax employees or people that have this capacity to like maintain attention on something for a long time. And I think it's such an interesting person to make kind of like this hero or protagonist. But I really comes back to this idea of attention and this idea of you will fall into the easy narratives. You will fall into the victim mentality or the hero story, whatever way you want it. And so what it takes that is the momentum of the stream of human beings. And what it takes is an active paddling against. And that is a skill. That is a skill that has a certain degree of endurance, and that is an endurance that needs to be built up over time through practice. But looking at character development not as the courage in the moment, but in this just effort in the quiet times, this effort in the journaling, this effort in the self-reflection, this focus, this attention, this self-reflection, it's a different way of looking at it, and I find it quite empowering. And it's a bit more modest, right? It's a bit more modest compared to like again, the courage or because then you fall into those traps of the human narrative.
That's a really good point. In a way, like This Is Water is a really good example of asking people to do an almost heroic level of imaginative engagement with the world around them. And I sometimes wonder if maybe Wallace succumbed to asking too much of himself to build a kind of novel around every interaction, to create all these, and you see it in his writing, the impulse to create every possible angle on something and all the footnotes that kind of take us to, and here's another way of looking at it, and here's another way of looking at it, until eventually you're caught up in this anxious, it looks playful, but it's a really anxious kind of play. But there's something a little bit more relaxed about kind of going, I don't know, maybe if you can kind of sort of not be so perfect and kind of go, well, I'm a jerk, or they're a jerk. But it's not the same thing as I need to come up with a reason for why they're a jerk, or I need to see it 8 different ways from Sunday. My favorite part of This Is Water is when he's in the mind of the ignorant person, the default mode, because I felt like it's so me, Like, he's queuing at a supermarket and he's like, who are all these people in my way? And why are they all so fat and ugly? You just have to kind of own that that's a part of me too,
Mm-hmm. Right on. I'm thinking now we'll get close towards the end because I'm conscious of your time, Michael. But before I do so, I'm encouraged to be a bit of a trickster myself. And it's that, like, this pursuit of developing admirable virtues, and I use the word admirable because there's an aesthetic quality to them. I find that quite interesting, in fact, that there is an aesthetic quality to virtues, and something we look upon and think this is good. And I wonder then, why is that? And then it brings me to this idea of gene expression, and that ultimately cultures, it seems, come from our genealogy. We form these things, and more than likely, if you've read anything by Antonio Damasio, he will talk about homeostatic pressures not being that of just finding balance, but that of finding flourishment, so that we can replicate and we can continue to grow. And if these virtues are attractive to us, so in a way they're positively emotive, so they're leading us towards perhaps flourishment, is this why they're attractive to us? I'm wondering, basically, just opening up maybe a thought experiment, why is it that these particular virtues have an aesthetic quality that we consider good? And is that something to do with us surviving, something to do with us thriving as a species, not burning? Have you thought about this?
Yeah, so I'm always I really enjoy these conversations, but it's weird doing a PhD in ancient philosophy, because you end up with this I don't even have the contemporary paradigm, right? So you quote these contemporary people, and it's I don't have any idea what they are, but I know what Aristotle would say about this. So I have this really I have this whole old paradigm that I'm working from, and the basic view is that human beings want the Stoic view is that human beings want to be great. They want to be excellent. And what that means is that's a psychological necessary fact, because what it means to be motivated towards something is to recognize that thing is good, right? We are always motivated towards what we recognize as good. There's other complexities about this, about weakness of will and stuff that I don't think we have enough time to get into, but the Stoics think you do things because you think they're good. Maybe you think other things are good. Maybe you think, maybe you think there's reasons why it's also bad, but you do things because you think they're good. So why do we pursue virtues? Because we think those things are what make a great person, is the simple answer. And we disagree about these, right? Like some people think that, even just Western, Eastern culture about the role of like individual excellence versus your capacity to be a part of a group or part of a team, right? Differ, right? So different cultures have different conceptions of what an excellent person is, but these things are always going to be motivating. In terms of whether they commit to flourishing, I mean, the Stoics have the ancient philosophy is a very particular view of flourishing. And what flourishing is to do excellently what human beings are meant to do. And for the Stoics, so that's a very loaded question. So you're looking for a teleology, right? And a teleology is the Greek word for the end, the purpose, right? So humans are trying to achieve their purpose. They look at the purpose evolutionarily, developmentally. I mean, evolution wouldn't be the word they use, but basically they say each species has a different function or purpose that is defined by what they uniquely do well. So for Aristotle, what humans uniquely do well is we are social animals that also have the capacity to reason. So to flourish is to maximize the animal part of ourselves. We have strong bodies, good nutrition, a good amount of wealth. We maximize the social part of ourselves. We're integrated into communities. We are kind to the people around us. We engage in pro-social behavior and maximize the intellectual part of ourselves. We are well-read. We're knowledgeable about philosophy. We're able to use that theory to help in our other pursuits. For the Stoics, they say what a human being is, what makes them what they are, is they are a decision-making being. They are the capacity to make choices. That is what we have that other people don't have. So for a Stoic, a great person, a flourishing person, is a person who makes the right choices. And what a right choice is not the best thing. It's the best thing with the circumstances you have, right? So the best card player, the best poker player is not the person who always gets the best hand. It's the person who makes the best choice with the hand they're given, even if they're sometimes going to lose the game or the hand. That's the Stoic answer. I don't know if it's what you're looking for, because I'm bringing in that ancient paradigm instead of the contemporary one. But that's the answer, is that to flourish as a human for the Stoics is to just make the best choices you can in the situations you're in. And that's it. And by limiting that scope, it's whether or not you agree with that, there's something empowering about that and something kind of freeing about that, because it means that the quality of our lives are up to us, which is quite nice.
I really like that. It's very practical. It seems immediately implementable. When I was proposing the question, something that was in the back of my mind was, it seems that the yogic pursuit is that of samadhi, a type of enlightenment, which seems quite abstract. But in this Stoic view of what we're pursuing, it seems like very immediate. It's here and now, and we can reap the rewards right now in our personal interactions within society.
I mean, this is what Epictetus talks about, right? Epictetus says, like, the Olympic Games is right here, right? Like he uses the Olympic Games as like this proxy. It's this way to like motivate these people by like, oh, you think this is like you think the Olympics are the greatest achievement you can get? No, like acting virtuously, acting correctly is the greatest achievement you can get. That's the real Olympic Games. And it turns out the real Olympic Games is right here, right now, all the time. And you might lose, but you don't have to wait 4 years. You just get to compete again tomorrow. And that's an appeal to it, and the immediacy, as you talk about. Now, obviously, it's going to take years and years to become perfect, but each battle, each competition is immediate, accessible, and perhaps even winnable. Although to win all of them always, I think, is something that takes time to develop.
Right on. Colm, have you anything to add before we bid each other farewell?
It's been an absolute pleasure, Michael. I really hope that we have you on again. I feel like we just sort of scraped the surface.
Yeah, there's
so much more.
There was more to dig down each one. It was like, okay, we'll go quick over everything, but there's so much to talk about.
But like you say, every day is the Olympics, so we don't have to wait 4 years.
Yeah. No, I'd love to be back on. This was a really, really fun. I think in the spirit of play, it was very back and forth and very collaborative. So really, really happy to talk about any of this stuff again.
Cool.
Right on, man. I'd love to have you back as well. Here. Till the next time. So,
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
thanks, guys. All the best. Take care.
Bye-bye.